Hello. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Office Hours by the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Office Hours at a library lost in the sands of time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 90 of Ancient Office Hours. This week, I spoke with Dr. Jake Nabel, a professor of classics at Pennsylvania State University. He is a historian of pre-Islamic Iran, ancient Rome, and the interactions between the two. His book, The Arsacids of Rome, Misunderstanding in Roman-Parthian Relations, will be published by the University of California Press in early 2025. In this episode, we discuss finding his niche from Confucius to Socrates to Rome, who were the Parthians, Parthian-Roman cultural exchanges, and navigating the loss of material evidence between the fall of the Parthian Empire and the beginning of the Sasanian Empire. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me on the show, Jake. And I want to start us off with what I hope will be an easy question and ask you, when did you get interested in classics and like the ancient world?
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I've listened to many episodes of Ancient Office Hours, so it's a real treat to actually be on the show. Thanks for having me. When I got into classics was as an undergraduate. I was not one of these people actually who grew up from, my earliest memories are reading Greek myths or anything like this. I did take a philosophy class in high school that covered Plato and Aristotle, but only in a very superficial way. When I got to Bard College, which is where I did my undergrad, I just was very lucky, and I had my very first semester a class called Confucius and Socrates, and it was taught by William Mullen, who taught at Bard for many years, and I just instantaneously fell in love with the material. There was something about reading Plato that just reached out and grabbed me and has never let go. But even from that very formative experience, it really left a big mark on me, I think, that you didn't just do classics and you only thought about Greece and Rome, and you had a very insular view of those societies and studied them in isolation. You did this as a comparative venture. You did this as an intercultural venture. It was something that allowed you to put ancient thought and ancient philosophy in dialogue with the ancient thought and philosophies of other cultures, and allowed you to make connections and make distinctions. And there was something very intellectually exciting about putting some of the kind of first articulation of a lot of human problems, starting in Greece and Rome, and then doing that across ancient cultures. There was something about that that just really fascinated me, and it took a while for me to circle back to the connections between Greece and Rome and other ancient peoples, but I got back there eventually and ended up in my sort of, research core area, being in that sort of focus, and I've been fascinated ever since.
Oh, that's such a fun path. And so when you finally got on this sort of journey and you were in school, did you always gravitate to the more Roman stuff? Was there a flirtation with Greece?
There was more than a flirtation. I went steady with Greece immediately because Greek was the language that I took, the ancient language that I took first, beginning in my sophomore year. And I took it all through undergraduate. Kind of ironically, since I did end up making my primary home in Rome as a Roman historian, I actually never took Latin as an undergraduate. I only came to it very late, and having done Greek for quite a while. And my initial interests were in Greek political history, the Hellenistic period. I was fascinated at first with the way that Greek culture sort of rode the conquests of Alexander the Great into the Iranian plateau and Central Asia. It just was so fascinating to me, as I think it is to many others, to picture Greek political forms and Greek cultural forms taking root in Iran, in Central Asia, and picturing Greek political life taking place on the Oxus River in Afghanistan. So that was where my initial interest was. And the way I kind of split the difference at the end of the day was to do Roman history, which, as I mentioned, that's kind of, I guess, the first scholarly hat that I wear is Roman history, but to look at Rome's interaction with one of the successors of the Hellenistic world in the East, which is the Parthian Empire, a people that had always throughout their history a strong Iranian tendency to adopt Iranian cultural forms, but also minted coins in Greek and was conversant with Greek literature and was shaped by the Hellenistic legacy in all kinds of ways. So at the end of the day, I guess I was lucky and found a way to do, both the core of what is usually considered classical Mediterranean history while marrying that to the long and complicated trajectory of Hellenism in territories that are not usually considered part of the classical world. And I think doing both those things is interesting, and doing both those things is important.
That's quite a turn. And it's funny because I want to say I'm impressed that you were lured away, because I feel like opinions are so entrenched. You're either like hardcore Latinist or hardcore Hellenist, and a lot of people don't really want to make the switch. So when you do catch people making the switch, right, you're like, oh, they must be early on before they get sort of into their camp. So one, yes, it's impressive that you were able to be drawn away from ancient Greece and becoming primarily a Greek historian. So when you were interested initially in sort of getting into the Parthians and the more Near Eastern Persian side, did you find that difficult? Like, did anyone actually teach this? Like, how were you even able to put that together?
I was lucky, I would say. So I did not enter, certainly not undergraduate, and even my PhD program with the foggiest idea that I would end up doing anything related to ancient Iran. It was when I was searching around for a dissertation topic and landed on, to me, to my mind, the very fertile but also very under-researched area of Roman foreign relations with the world of the Parthians. There wasn't really a template for how to go about doing this kind of thing. Parthia is a weird ancient empire to study because a lot of their primary materials from the territories of the empire itself, they are Greek. They minted coins in Greek, and there are Greek inscriptions from Parthia. And in that way, it's kind of always been considered a sort of annex of the classical world. But there's also Iranian material. There's also Akkadian material. And it demands a kind of set of competencies that graduate programs are really not set up to offer. But I think I was lucky when I started to write my dissertation that I met some people who really made it a lot easier for me to do this. One was a German scholar named Josef Wiesehofer, who is the most kind and generous person and the most kind and generous scholar I think anyone could ever meet, who within minutes of meeting me said, come to Germany and do a semester with me, and you can take some Iranian languages there. I can read your dissertation chapters, and I can give you some training in what it means to be an Iranist. And I did that, and I profited a great deal from doing so. Another mentor I was very lucky to happen upon was UCLA's Rahim Shaigan, who also, within minutes of meeting me and learning about my research, brimming with ideas about how I could, gain more competencies in Parthian history while having one foot planted in the Roman world on the other hand. And Rahim has been an amazing collaborator and mentor in that regard as well. So I got lucky by meeting some key people at the right time. But I will say, I think the field of classics is moving in a good direction here. It's easier now to try to wear multiple hats at the same time, to wear a Hellenist hat and to wear a Mesopotamianist hat, for instance. These kinds of things are encouraged. There is more support now for graduate students who want to develop a curriculum that will allow them to train in different kinds of languages. And even the job market, which does not reward an awful lot and is pretty brutal in many respects, I think even the job market has been more encouraging and more willing to offer positions to people who can bridge the cultures of the classical Mediterranean and the Near East. So things are moving in a positive direction, and hopefully it won't be necessary for people to reinvent the wheel when they find that they have this dual set of interests, so to speak.
Yeah, I like how the field is moving in a very much more collaborative, interdisciplinary direction, because I think for so long, right, we'd sort of been in our little silos of specialties, and you would really have to collaborate with an expert from a different field to have something. But I do like how I feel like the more classes I meet and talk to, they aren't just sort of one dimensional. Oh, I don't just focus on Greek tragedy. I do so much more. And I think it is truly wonderful. But also, yes, unfortunately, luck does play a big role in kind of determining someone's path. You know, who do you meet? Who ends up becoming a good mentor? And so it's very wonderful to hear that you had two very good ones who were able to help you kind of grow in your studies and help you figure out the path that you wanted to take. So I think that's absolutely lovely. Now, for my audience who we haven't had a lot of people, you might be the first or second person who has dealt in some way with ancient Iran, ancient Persia on my show. And so I would love it if you could just set us a small little timeline and sort of place the Parthians between sort of the bigger dynasties that some people may be more familiar with.
Very gladly, yes. Well, most classicists are familiar with ancient Iran or ancient Persia. They're familiar with it first and foremost as ancient Persia because the Persians were the big, established, and very wealthy imperial power in the ancient Near East during the Greek classical period. And of course, authors like Herodotus in the world of Greek historiography and Aeschylus in the world of Greek tragedy, we know that they thought a lot about the Persians and the Greeks in general. As Greek culture took shape in the 5th century BCE, the heart of the classical period, the Greeks are defining themselves to a very considerable degree in contradistinction to the Persians and who the Persians are and what they represent. Most classicists are also familiar with the conquest of Alexander the Great, who brings the Achaemenid Empire to an end, but also as a consequence of his campaigns, projects quite forcibly Greek culture and Greek political forms into Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, and even Central Asia as part of his conquests. And his successors ruled that territory for a couple of hundred years. But in the middle of the 3rd century BCE, starting in Parthia, which is a region of Central Asia, there is a rebellion led against one of the successors of Alexander the Great. His general Seleucus had founded an empire that became the main beneficiary of the Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia, Central Asia. So the Parthian Empire begins as a rebellion against that successor empire. It starts out small, but by the 2nd century BCE, it's become quite large. It now rules the core territory of Parthia, but also the Iranian plateau. It conquers the very big and populous and rich and fertile region of Mesopotamia and is in charge of the very sizable Greek cities there. And who the Parthians are and essentially what they represent has always been a great mystery and a great riddle. It's one of the fascinating things about studying them, to try to figure out, just exactly who were these people and how do we characterize them? Were they a native Iranian rebellion against the colonial imposition of Greek language, culture, administration? Are they quasi-Hellenistic themselves? There's a very good case to be made for that because they mint coins in Greek. They are conversant with Greek literature. as I mentioned. So certainly when their empire begins, they have a foot planted very firmly in the Hellenistic world. But as the centuries wear on, the Parthians hold power for a very long time, all the way till the 3rd century CE. And over the course of that time, you see a diminishment in the prevalence of Greek culture, the prevalence of the Greek language and its use in various media, and you see a resurgence in Iranian forms. So the use of Parthian, which is a Middle Iranian language, begins to supplant Greek in key kinds of contexts over the course of the first century CE and afterward. And by the time the Parthians lose power in Iran in the 3rd century CE, their ruling dynasty has morphed into something quite different, and it's laid the groundwork for the real emergence of an Iranian culture in late antiquity that calls itself by that name, that explicitly identifies as Iranian, that has the religion of Zoroastrianism as its chief religion, and that has largely pushed Greek to the margins in a number of ways. So the Parthians are kind of the bridge between the Hellenistic period and Iranian late antiquity. But of course, they have a long and winding history, and both of those things are involved really at every step of the journey.
I mean, I think before speaking with you, I didn't appreciate or know how long Parthian history was, right? I think this is one of the empires and one of the words you hear and you go, oh, yes, yeah, they were somewhere in history. I don't know, somewhere in Iran. Great. Right. And then you realize they were there for a long time. And a lot happens like around the rest of the world in that time as well. And so for my audience who now want to know how you connected this to Rome, when the Parthian Empire emerged, what was happening in Rome?
Well, the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire, they kind of reach their imperial adulthoods, so to speak, at around the same time. The Romans, really, they're both conquering the Greek world at basically the same time. And from the Greek point of view, you can kind of say you've got barbarians advancing from the west in the form of Romans, and barbarians advancing from the east in the form of the Parthians. And eventually they divide up the entire Hellenistic world between them. The Romans and Parthians, they don't start to deal expressly with one another and directly with one another until the 1st century BCE. And that's a very momentous time in Roman Parthian history. There is some diplomacy between the two cultures. There are some battles between the two cultures. The famous one comes in 53 BCE. It's called the Battle of Carrhae. And this is one of the most devastating defeats that the Romans are ever handed by a foreign power. It basically puts the kibosh on Roman dreams of expanding into Mesopotamia, at least for the foreseeable future. 10,000 Romans are taken prisoner, many thousands lose their lives. It's a serious moment in the checking of Rome's eastward imperial ambitions. But they continue to deal with one another in war and in diplomacy for as long as the Parthian Empire survives. And the subject of my book is about a quite direct form of interface between the two empires. Members of the Parthian royal family go to Rome to live. So we have a decent amount of evidence for Parthian royalty who lived in Rome. Some of them spent years there. Some of them spent decades. Some of them spent their entire lives there and died there. And we have evidence for their funerary monuments. And some go back to Parthia. So that's a very intimate kind of connection where these cultures are exchanging some of the most important and politically powerful people that either has to offer. So they have a long and contentious, rich history of interaction, sometimes as enemies, very often as enemies, but sometimes as sort of colleagues or partners in world rule. And sometimes some of the rhetoric that comes out of our sources is very sort of, well, to borrow a metaphor from later antiquity, after the Parthians are taken over by the Sasanians, you can look at these two empires as the two eyes of the earth. Of course, every face needs two eyes, and in that regard, the two eyes both have a part to play in joint world rule and in dividing the known world between them. So it's a rich history, it's a contentious history, and it's one that I think we are just starting to understand in all of its complexity.
Yeah, I mean, that's really cool. And it is definitely a large topic that I didn't really know anything about. And so it's wonderful to hear that, people like yourself are doing more research. And so you can educate us about the relationship and what was happening. And I am curious because I had a wonderful conversation the other day about sort of Greek ceramic influence in the Persian Empire. So that got me thinking. Now I want to ask, how much of Roman cultural influence actually made its way into like Parthian consciousness or vice versa? Because I know Greece famously, right? They want to take everything and then put a very Greekified spin on it and then sort of resell it to the world as it's our thing, very Greek, and it's unmistakably Greek because they really wanted the world to sort of revolve around them. So I'm curious if, in this later period, there was maybe more acceptance in sort of cultural motifs or other influences passing back and forth.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And certainly there is a certain amount of cultural cross-pollination. One place we see this very, very clearly, as far as material culture goes, is Palmyra. It was in the first and second century CE, especially, a vital trade city that supplied the Roman Empire with all kinds of goods that were coming from Eastern markets. And the Palmyrines, as we know from inscriptions, are very, very active all throughout Parthian Mesopotamia. They're especially running caravans from Palmyra, which is in Syria, down to the Persian Gulf, which is where a lot of sea traffic comes in, especially from Indian ports. And the Palmyrines, as a result of their intimate familiarity with both Roman and Parthian culture, there are elements of Parthian iconography that end up in the Palmyrene material record. For instance, trousers, which are quite characteristic of the Parthian world, Parthian jewelry and ornamentation. There are certain Parthian administrative titles that the Palmyrines even take on. So Palmyra is one case where there really are people who are intermediaries between these two empires, well versed in the ways of both, and their culture ends up being a fascinating cross-pollination of two different cultural traditions. So Palmyra is one place where you see it very clearly in the material record. There are other kinds of interactions as well, which leave a mark. One example that comes to mind, this is a case I talk about in my book, is one of the Parthian royalty, who I mentioned a moment ago, who lives in Rome and then goes back to Parthia. And we have his coins from when he became king in Parthia. And fascinatingly, it appears he is the only Parthian king in generations and generations who shows himself with a short hairstyle. Usually Parthian kings have these long cascading curls on their coins, but he has a short hairstyle. Some scholars have made the case this is a sign of someone who spent a lot of time in the Roman Empire, was actually much more familiar with Roman numismatic conventions than with Parthian ones. And so he went back and attempted to represent himself in a way that he was sort of used to seeing, not from Parthia, but from Rome. Interestingly, what was the result of this kind of thing? There's some questions about how to interpret the textual record, but it's actually possible that that actually backfired on him in a major way. Sometimes people who are familiar and conversant with other cultures can be kind of viewed with suspicion in the home culture because they're, are they really one of us anymore? This is especially true if somebody lives for many years away from their home. Are they really a Parthian anymore, or have they become a Roman in some ways? So it's possible. It depends on how you interpret some of our textual sources, but it's possible actually that to a degree interconnection and exchange between the two empires might have fueled a kind of backlash on one or both sides, where people said, well, actually, no, that's not a welcome influence here. And this is something we need to be very careful about and be on our guard against. So interconnection and exchange has a definite, clear legacy, which we can see in some of our sources and our material sources, not least. But it's not the kind of uncomplicated, cosmopolitan sort of vision of globalization that one might have today, reading discourses of pluralism and diversity and cultural exchange. So it's a complicated and contested legacy.
What you were mentioning made me think of this, see, at least in Europe especially, right? The practice of aristocratic families, descendants of kings, sending their children to study at prestigious universities in like the UK, right? And then them being away for so long that by the time they come back, their own people are kind of like, well, yeah, you're our prince or whatever, but you were just studying your whole life in the UK to be cultured or civilized or whatever term they wanted to use. And they are viewed with suspicion coming back and saying, well, are you really our prince? If you weren't born and raised and educated here, do you understand our people? And this was a quite common practice. I mean, we even see this with Kim Jong-un. He studied in like Switzerland, but
Right.
He has no problem, but that's also the unique way their country is set up. But he's sent back, and so he got this wonderful Western education, and yet it's fine. So I don't know, like for us, it seems pretty common. In this instance, was it just the one you were referencing earlier, or like did this become a more common practice to go and stay and be in the Roman Empire, or was it kind of still an outlier?
The figure I mentioned is not an outlier. He is part of a series of exchanges that are made, not for the entirety, interestingly, of the Roman-Parthian relationship, but from the late 1st century BCE into the mid-1st century CE. In total, it's a period of almost 100 years that the Parthians send members of their ruling dynasty to Rome. And yes, I mean, a very rich point of comparison with the modern period is from colonial contexts where various European empires colonized the world. Elites from the areas that are colonized, for all sorts of reasons, very often found it expedient to send their children to, yes, for instance, elite English boarding schools is quite a common experience. And of course, the British Empire is not the only empire that sees these kind of things happening. It's certainly a germane comparison for the Parthian case, but I would add one point of caution, which is that in the case of European colonialism, the power dynamics are very clear. Europe is inflicting colonies. It is the active imperialist power, and the relationship between locals and their colonizers in terms of power is quite legible to us. It's easy to read. What I try to show in the book, actually, is that for the Parthians, this is not a colonial context. It's not the case that the Parthians view the Romans as a superior power and, oh, we need to send our royal children to be educated in the superior ways of the superior political power. I don't view it that way at all. And what I try to argue is that actually the Parthians have a tradition of fosterage, which is when children are raised by parents who are not biologically related to them, who are not their natal parents. There are all sorts of reasons that fosterage can be used cross-culturally, but in Parthia, my view is that actually, in most cases, you had a superior sending their children to a subordinate to be raised. So the boss sends his kids to his employees to bring up, and this is a sign of the boss's power. this is a kind of thing that a boss does. It's a sign of a superior to send your children somewhere else, not the mark of an inferior. So my argument is that whereas the Romans think exactly as you just referred to the Europeans thinking, the children of indigenous elites come to us because our culture is better, we are the higher political power, and we have the upper hand in this arrangement. So it's natural they come to us. But I think over on the Parthian side, the Parthian kings say to themselves, we'll send our children to the Romans precisely because the Romans are inferior to us and they should do what clients have to do, which is raise the children of their superiors. So each side kind of thinks it's superior and each side thinks it's coming out on top. But in fact, they're just kind of talking past one another and misunderstanding one another. So it allows both sides in a way to kind of have their cake and eat it too, but they're not quite on the same page about what the circulation of these children means in terms of power dynamics.
This could set up a brilliant rom-com where you have like a 12th nightish kind of extravaganza of miscommunication.
Yes.
Or Much Ado About Nothing. Actually, it's a Much Ado About Nothing is what I would say it is. It sounds fascinating. And it's funny because I'm like, okay, so yeah, Romans are thinking more like our modern day colonialist Europeans. And then what it sounds like is that the Parthians were like, we're so rich. Rome's the nanny. Rome is literally the nanny. And
right.
And I guess if you wanted to take a more objective stance from detaching ourselves from either of their perspectives, I guess I would look at it as just study abroad. Study abroad, like I'm going from a nice university here in the States, which already implies a degree of privilege because I'm coming from a, U.S. institution. And yet I'm like, great, I'm going to go study at University of Edinburgh in Scotland, which is wonderful and prestigious, but just different, right? It's not better, it's not worse, it's different. Because I suppose, unfortunately, when we think about elite education in today's society, you still think of either American or elite British universities kind of as the best. Now, that is quite debatable, but just looking at that perception, yeah, it's interesting. So I would say, oh, that's study abroad.
Yeah.
I love these stories of, these are very ancient peoples, very ancient practices, and yet they relate so wonderfully because you can find so many great parallels in the modern era. We just call it something vastly different and have very different, circumstances or ideas.
Yes, and because our world is getting smaller in a lot of ways, it's more common for people today to have these kinds of, well, the study abroad is a great example. The opportunity to spend a semester in a foreign country as an educational experience, this is something that over the course of the past few decades has become far more common, and the necessity of grappling with the alienness and the foreignness of other cultures is much more immediate to American young people, for instance, for that reason, and that makes these ancient cases all the more fascinating because our shrinking world, shrinking because of globalization, is a relatively recent phenomenon. The ancient world was characterized by a lot more interconnectivity than we tend to give it credit for in a lot of ways. And it's fascinating and useful to contemplate how did the ancient experience of grappling with the alien, of grappling with a foreign culture, was it ennobling for them? Was it a didactic experience in the way that it is for us, or at least the way that we like to think of our study abroad experiences going? Unfortunately, at a certain point, the ancient evidence is just not detailed and descriptive enough to tell us, certainly we don't have like a memoir or an autobiography written by any of the Parthian royal children we were talking about. If only we did, we would have a lot clearer idea of exactly what the experience of living the metropole of a foreign empire meant to them exactly. That would be great. But it's very useful and instructive to think about what kind of experience was it for them? What does that say about the cultural distance between the ancient and modern world? And how can we learn from ancient cases about how to bridge these gaps and how to communicate more effectively with people who share none of our cultural assumptions and in a lot of ways come from cultural backgrounds which are totally illegible and unfamiliar to us. I don't have good answers to any of those questions in the abstract, but I do know that, thinking about Roman-Parthian relations has helped me grapple with them more effectively, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. I mean, as we've just shown, like we're drawing so many different connections, both ancient and modern. And I hope you'll allow me to go on a bit of a journey. And this may be later than what you actually focus on, but I think it's relevant. And so, since I can do whatever I want, I'm going to take us on a little journey. By the time the Parthians are kind of ending, let's say, I do know that we have some evidence. Well, the reason we don't have a lot of material culture and remains of like Parthian cities and stuff is because the Sasanians came in and sort of started destroying everything, right, to erase them and establish their own mythology and their own connections to the Achaemenids and whatever they needed to do to make whatever they were doing work. So by this time, when the Parthians are kind of on their way out, ending, and having all of their ruins destroyed, was this idea of exchange, right? This ancient study abroad, whatever we want to call it, nannying, whatever. Like, was that a practice that the Sasanians saw as like, too close to the Greeks, so it was bad, so this is part of why we need to destroy everything because we didn't like this? Because I don't know enough about the Sasanians at all to be able to even say whether, they continued this sort of exchange or dialogue with, and of course Rome has changed a lot by then as well, but like we still have, even after the division of Rome, you still have the Eastern Roman Empire and you still have the Western half. So like by this later period in history that neither you and I really focus on, I'm just curious whether, this practice though contributed to essentially Parthian evidence being completely destroyed.
Certainly, the Parthians continue fosterage practices. The Sasanians continue fosterage practices. We have good evidence from the Sasanian period that shows this very clearly within their empire. That cliental fosterage, which is the practice of sending the superior sending their kids to the inferior to be raised. We have good evidence that the Sasanians do this with Persian elites, with client kings within their empire. So certainly the practice continues on that scale. What doesn't continue is the Roman extension of it. And that actually had been cut off while the Parthians were still in charge of the Iranian plateau. Those exchanges seem to end during the reign of Nero, actually. That's the last sort of gasp of it. And I have a few remarks in my book about why that might have been. There are a number of variables that you can consider. It's difficult to make a decisive case for any one particular thing. It may have been that the Romans and Parthians started to understand one another better and kind of gained an awareness of what the other side was thinking. And, after a couple generations of sending their royal children to Rome, it may have started to filter back to the Parthians that the Romans didn't call them foster children or study abroad participants or anything like that. They called them hostages. And the Romans did that pretty consistently. So does that vocabulum, does that terminology get back to Parthia immediately? Do the Parthians care immediately? There's every reason to think they would have been very self-assured and, perhaps not especially bothered by the Romans describing it in a different way. They might not have cared, but over time, as the two cultures became more familiar with one another, perhaps through this very medium of child circulation, they may have been more difficult to maintain this very convenient misunderstanding between them, which allowed them to both be the superior party in a lot of ways. So by the time the Sasanians come to power, there isn't a long continuous tradition of sending Sasanian princes and princesses to Rome. The Romans never reciprocate, by the way. It's not like Roman royal children are going to Parthia or later to the Sasanians. So there isn't that tradition to build upon. Now, that's not to say that only hostility and mutual suspicion characterize Roman-Sasanian relations, because because there actually is a lot of kind of collegiality, and it's during the Sasanian period where you see the metaphor of Rome and Persia are the two eyes of the earth, which is just a beautiful metaphor for not only coexistence and harmony, but the idea that both empires are an essential and indispensable part of the world order. That's a Sasanian period quotation, not a Parthian period one. Some modes of interchange die out, but not all of them. It's not like Roman Sasanian late antiquity is only characterized by xenophobia and alienation and political re-entrenchment on both sides of the Euphrates River. And in terms of what this tells us, if anything, about Sasanian relationship to the Parthian past, not much. It's definitely true that at least as far as the memory of Parthia in Iranian history, in the kind of Sasanian grand narrative of the Iranian past, the Parthians and the kings who ruled them, they get very short shrift, and they are kind of downgraded to petty kings, is what that's how they're configured in the Sasanian memory, which does not do justice to an empire that was around, as you noted, for a very long time, and in fact longer than the Achaemenids who preceded them or the Sasanians who followed them. So that's not a fair shake that the Parthians get in the historical memory of Iran. It's not clear, certainly we don't have conclusive evidence that the Sasanians destroy Parthian monuments or anything like this. They may have, but it's very difficult to say conclusively that happens on the basis of our evidence. But it is pretty clear that the Parthians get downgraded and they are minimized and shortchanged in the history of Iran's ancient past.
Which is a shame, because they sound very interesting, and especially occupying such a long period of time, which, as you noted, was longer than the other dynasties around them. So wow, history has not been kind to them. And that's really a shame. It's further a shame that because I think they've been downgraded through history, and then evidence is, sparing and hard, there's not even a lot that you can do, even with modern popular culture. I mean, how many things of Greece and Rome do we have? We have a lot. And then Persia in general doesn't get a lot. I mean, if you're lucky, you'll get a Xerxes here or a Darius mentioned there, or maybe a Cyrus or a Cambyses if you're really lucky, which is bizarre, because you could totally do a Game of Thrones-y thing with Persian history and it would work perfectly. So I don't know why someone hasn't capitalized on that. But in terms of Rome things, and as you describe yourself primarily as a Roman historian, I'm a little curious, in your spare time, do you enjoy taking in popular media of ancient Rome? Do you look elsewhere? And if you do like ancient Roman things, do you have a favorite book or media adaptation of something Roman?
Oh, that's an easy one. The HBO series Rome is very well done. I wish it were still going. I wish it were in its 20th season right now. Nothing would delight me more. But I think it's a great adaptation for a number of reasons. I mean, one thing is that it's pretty responsible with a lot of Roman history. And in some ways, it's more interesting to watch that show for what's going on in the background, or what the characters are doing when they start to have their conversations, because they'll be doing things like carrying out a sacrifice to a god, or listening to a public speech by a Roman political candidate, or talking about what a prison is like in Rome, what incarceration is like in Rome. And those are just these elements of Roman social history which don't tend to make it into popular treatments of these topics. We kind of just think of what we tend to think about is the sort of the high political history, right? Julius Caesar's assassination, Augustus's ascent to power, Constantine, the kind of great names and big personalities that have always figured so prominently in Roman history. But a great thing about HBO's Rome is that you get to see Rome through the eyes of the poor, through the eyes of someone who is, a typical Roman legionary, through the eyes of the enslaved in Rome. You're opened up to all these different perspectives, and I think it's a really rich and mature treatment for that way. And of course, beautifully acted and very incredible production values. That's of course why the show didn't continue. It's just too expensive to keep using these lavish sets and things. But that's a fantastic, not just television show, not just popular adaptation of ancient Roman history, but for even people who do this for a living, there's so much to think about and so much to ponder in watching and rewatching that show. I would contrast that with something you mentioned a moment ago. Sometimes you get a mention of a Darius or a Xerxes in popular media, and on that score, I think American media culture has not done so well. I'm thinking, of course, of the 300 movies where the Persians are reduced to, to say like comic book villains almost doesn't even do justice to what happens in that movie. I mean, they're reduced literally to monsters. They are characterized with the most, outrageous, hard in the paint Orientalist tropes that you could possibly conjure up. And so some people have made the case to me, it's kind of the 300 movies are an interesting adaptation of Herodotus in some ways. But I think if you look even at what the ancient Greeks of the classical period did with Persian culture, the Persians are treated with so much more humanity, so much more curiosity, and so much more intellectual seriousness that I don't see very many reflections of that in the 300 movies, for instance. So, those are, I guess, two popularizing treatments of ancient history, really at the opposite end of the spectrum in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's so clear. It's clear as day. You can see the people who made Rome clearly. They consulted with people. They loved the topic. They found it interesting. They were really committed to showing us stuff that you wouldn't naturally think about. And it turned out fantastic. And I wish that, it hadn't been too expensive to continue. Because if Game of Thrones and that extravagant budget could get 8 seasons, what could Rome have gotten if it were made now? Goodness me. I think it would be. If they had tried to make it in the last 3 years, it would have multiple seasons. It would have 10 seasons. It would be fantastic. What a shame. But yes, I do agree. It is one of the best adaptations, even beyond just the historical stuff and the nuggets for historians. Just the story and the characters were really great and believable. Because I know sometimes they'll set unbelievable stories and figures in with inexplicably accurate settings or costuming. And you're like, you did so well. The armor is really authentic. And then you're like, why is it in a story that makes 0 sense? So, it's quite interesting. So
yeah, it's great. I mean, even in what they make up, where they depart from, the historical record, because of course they're not historians, they're storytellers, and that's their primary responsibility, is to tell you a good story. But even where they fill in the gaps, it makes you think about, well, what was the experience of somebody in that kind of situation? I mean, if all you go on is the ancient evidence, sometimes you don't do that kind of imaginative and creative work. And the show, it gets you to do that in a lot of ways. And that's a perspective and an approach to history that professional historians aren't so used to taking, but it's very revealing. And of course, for the public, these are the kinds of things the public is often interested in. And it's not just creative professionals who should have an answer to those questions. It's professional historians also, I think.
yeah, no, I totally agree. But I mean, even down to the timeline, the names they use, you don't just have a random weird foreign name for a clearly Roman character. And even the foreign characters have names that aren't clearly super Roman, unless they had an explanation for it, which if they did, they did. But it's even to things because I'll compare it to one of my favorite films of all time, even though it's quite inaccurate, is the Russell Crowe Gladiator. You have a great story, but you put him in with Commodus and Marcus Aurelius, and then you have this unbelievable thing where I'm like, murder? And then you have what? Who killing Commodus? What? So it's even kind of that stuff where I'm like, okay, I can see some things look pretty accurate or some things are good, but then you have an unbelievable story where every historian will groan and go, that's not how he died. Wait, what are you doing? You don't find that with Rome. And that's refreshing. And it's still drama filled with tension and all this great stuff. Yeah. So I don't know. It's a great blueprint for what can be done right without having to be like actually historical, but you could play in history is your playground, but in like the good way, right? And that's excluding like video games, which have popped up as being a new center for having things be accurate but also be entertaining. So I think Rome is the gold standard, even all these years later. And it was made a super long time ago. It was made in like 2005, I want to say, 5 or 6 or something. So it's astounding that it's been able to maintain that spot. But we could go on and on about all the different great Roman media adaptations and a bunch of other things. But we would both be very, very old and dead by the time we got through everything out there. So I will move us along and say that there are a couple of questions that I use to sort of end the interview portion of the episode. And the first is, when you were in school, you can say either as an undergrad or a grad student, did you attend office hours?
Yes, absolutely. I was lucky, as I mentioned, to have professors who really kind of kindled a passion for me for the ancient world. And part of that, and part of Bard College, the institution where I did my undergraduate work, was the notion that class didn't end when class ended. You were always thinking about the themes, the issues, the questions that came up in your class. You took them home with you. You took them to other classes with you. Socrates would bring up a question that would pop up in different ways in half a dozen classes. But also one of the ways that you continued to do coursework outside of class was going to office hours was encouraged. It wasn't expected or mandatory, but it was encouraged, and it was fun. I mean, it just was a way to take these questions that, for me, at various points in time in my undergraduate education, were burning questions that I needed to get my thoughts out, and there was more in class than I had time to say. And I'm very grateful to my professors from that time period for allowing me to show up and to do so quite frequently, and to continue the conversation with them usually on a one-to-one basis. And that unlocked a lot of things for me that led me to a lot of insights I wouldn't have otherwise had. And the intimate relationship I had with my professors from that period, it shapes who I try to be as a teacher of the ancient world now, and it certainly left a big mark on who I am as a person. I went to office hours, and I'm all the better for it, I would say.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to sort of turn it around and say you can draw on experience as an educator yourself or stick with when you were a student. Do you have a particular conversation, instance, memory, something fun that happened to you in a formal or informal office hour that you look back on fondly?
I remember quite well from when I was a graduate student, actually, but teaching introductory Latin, second semester, first year Latin. Students who, were kind of reaching the back of the textbook, but certainly they hadn't completed the first year, and they hadn't gone on to the second year, which is traditionally when you start to read extensively from real texts, and maybe you'll spend a whole semester with one author. But I remember quite distinctly from late in that second semester, there was a group of students, and at a certain point, they just asked if we could have an evening session to read from a real Latin text. We read with no question about extra credit or trying to parlay that into a higher course grade or anything, just for no other reason than they were interested in the material. They wanted to get together and read real Latin. And so we read from book one of Virgil's Aeneid. And I recognized in those students in that moment the kind of just fascination and endless, sort of breathless curiosity about a culture that was so distant in time and in geographical distance, of course, also from my own, and it's a treasured memory.
Oh, that's so wonderful. I love wonderful things when students come and have a great time, and also when you get to enjoy something that's a little different than what I think people normally expect. And so I guess on this topic of office hours, if you had to pitch students like a 30-second pitch on why it's important to go to office hours, what would you tell them?
I would say get as much face time with your professors as you can. And one reason why studying the ancient world is great in general is that often your professors will have a lot more time for you and will learn more about you as an individual than, in other classes where you're one of a couple dozen or a couple hundred students and you don't get that kind of intimate experience. Office hours is when you can have a one-on-one with someone who wants nothing more than to help you think about the material on a deeper, more meaningful, and more resonant basis. So study classics because you'll get to know your professors who genuinely care about your intellectual experience and your educational background. And because classics departments tend to be smaller, they are likely to have more time for you and would like nothing better in the world than to see you and talk to you about the things from class that you might be worried about, that you might be interested in, whatever the case may be. So much of what makes a liberal arts education, and especially studying the classical world, worthwhile has to do with a connection between a teacher and student, and there's no better place to work on that relationship than in office hours.
Well, I could not agree more because I definitely felt all those things and more when I was a young undergrad coming up, and I had close personal relationships with a couple of my professors who ended up being like second mothers or grandmothers to me. So 100% agree. So
I guess that might be why you started a podcast on that topic.
It might be because I missed having those great conversations with them in their offices, and especially after they sort of retired. And I was like, oh, well, I can't even go to a physical office anymore. I guess I'll have to find a new way to speak to them. At the end of each podcast, I ask every guest if they will read Shelley's Ozymandias poem. And now this is a poem that has been cited in popular culture as being influential or interesting or beautifully written. And so I would just be very interested to know whether you agree and, what do you think about the poem? How does it make you feel?
Okay. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." I love it. The first thing that comes to mind is the title King of Kings, which, well, is used by different people in the ancient world, but one group of people that's very well known for using it is the Achaemenid Persians. It begins as an Achaemenid Persian title. The Parthians then inherit it, perhaps not directly, but they end up using it as well, and the Sasanians who follow them. So all of the dynasties of ancient Iran use this title, and it evokes beautifully for me, the poem in general, an idea that I think many of us are familiar with from Herodotus, the idea that part of studying history is watching great things become small and small things become great. There is no knowing for certain which way history is trending. And often history goes in a direction that surprises you because what is powerful today is not so powerful tomorrow, and vice versa. But of course, contemplating the ruins of ancient societies and ancient civilizations, it doesn't just mean, of course, that, oh, these things can't possibly be significant because now they've been reduced from a great state down to a small state. We can learn and we should learn from the words they left behind, the materials they left behind, the signs of greatness that they left behind, because those things will teach us about the patterns of history, the cycles of history, the triumphs and tragedies of history. They'll enrich our lives and they'll make us better equipped to understand the present. All of those themes, I think, come out of the poem.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better. I mean, for me, I remember I read this, I want to say in high school, maybe before, but I don't really remember. So I attribute it to at some point to high school. But I remember I read it and it just grabbed me and it was so arresting that it instantly became my favorite poem of all time. And I was like, yep, nothing is going to top this. This is amazing. Because it hits on all those themes you just mentioned, but also because of my interest personally in politics and all these other things, it really serves as a very strong memento mori, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Reminder that you will die, we will die. And, I also consider the political situation in which Shelley was writing. He wrote it after they uncovered the statue in Egypt and after he knew that they were going to ship it to the British Museum. He started writing the poem and you're like, oh, very colonialist to write about this. But also, you have themes of monumentality and sort of legacy all wrapped into one. And so, yeah, it just adds so many different juicy layers to the possible influences that he had and why he crafted this sonnet so beautifully. I mean, he just puts so much into it and it's only 14 lines. And I'm like, that's impressive that it's short, but like he was able to convey so much. So thinking about the poem sort of on this line of monumentality and legacy, the last question I ask every single guest on the show is, if you consider our modern society today, like right now, do we have a modern Ozymandias? Like something, person, place, thing, idea, system, anything that like we currently think is amazing and so great, but like realistically, will humans in the future agree with us? Will they kind of look back and say that was a really stupid idea?
It's a profound question. Of course, what one's mind is immediately drawn to is, as people living in America, is our own nation and its legacy throughout the world, which is undergoing a profound period of crisis and re-entrenchment, at least, if not something more destabilizing even than that. And yeah, I think as people who work on the ancient world, we do tend to look back on previous scholarship and view it as sometimes, in some cases, very much a production of its moment. And we could say, for instance, oh, German scholars who worked on Macedonia and Alexander the Great in the late 19th century, of course, they're just interested in Philip and Alexander because these are people who managed to get a fledgling nation to coalesce and lead it to do great things, which is, of course, exactly what many Germans in the late 19th century were interested in doing, making a fledgling nation coalesce and leading it on to greatness. And there's a tendency, I think, to sometimes dismiss or play down scholarship for that reason, to dismiss ideas about the ancient past as purely kind of productions of the modern period. And there certainly is some wisdom to that. But of course, someday we ourselves are going to be the scholars and the interpreters of the ancient world who come in for that kind of treatment. What are we going to look like? What are our blind spots? How will people caricature and dismiss some of the good faith readings we have of the ancient past? It's very difficult to know how the future will treat you. And as people who study the ancient past and are aware of how legacies can be very long and very resounding, but also very difficult to manage, it's a salutary reminder that, one day we ourselves will be the ones lying in the dust, and we ourselves at that point will not be the cheap sculptors and architects of our own legacy. So all of the themes you mentioned, resonate very powerfully with me, and are good to keep in mind as we go about the task of interpreting the ancient world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's very profound. And also, I realized I do kind of slap people in the face with this very profound question right at the end where they're like, oh no, wait, I want more time. But it's fun to just get a little peek at, okay, what are initial thoughts? So like a lot of people do. And like I used to struggle with, we would kind of leave and then 3 hours later I'd be like, oh wait, I just had a great thought about this. Too late, darn.
Kind of a good conversation.
So hopefully this question will stick with you, and maybe it'll pop up eventually, and you'll think, "Oh, maybe I should, maybe this or maybe that." And I hope that my audience is also thinking similar things into the future. So I did kind of lie. There's one more question that I'm going to ask you, and that is, where can people find you if they would like to see your work, your book that you have referenced, and even email you because they want to come study with you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been on Twitter for a while, social media platform formerly known as Twitter. I'm still there at Jake Nabel for the time being. I'm not sure. We'll see whether Twitter turns into an Ozymandias-like heap of ruins before too long. But for the time being, I'm still on there, and my Penn State email is jnabel@psu.edu, and I'd love to hear from anybody who's interested in getting in touch on any topic.
Wonderful. And then do you have an academia page?
I do. Just Jake Nabel. I try to post whatever I can there, and thank you. I'd be very grateful.
Perfect. Well, we will link it. We'll make it easy for people to find you in case they would like to know anything, ask any question. Yeah, I'm sure. And I hope that people will follow you and follow your research because it is so fascinating, and it is a topic that I do not know a lot about that I also would like to learn more about, and I hope that people feel the same way.
That'd be great. And my office hour is 2 to 3 p.m. on Tuesdays.
Oh, perfect. Well, if you're on campus then at Penn State, you know what time and you know where to go. So I absolutely want to thank you so much for joining me today. It has been such a pleasure to speak with you.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you, Lexi.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient office hours. Next stop is Present Ponderings.